Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room. I'm Rob and Adair with John Juricic.
Yes.
And John, can you believe what's going on now with Donald Trump? We keep hearing new terrible things from that guy. He's taking his government apart. Of course, he's threatening these tariffs. We're going to hear a lot more about that on Canada, Mexico, half the world. He actually sent J.D. Vance to Germany to talk to all the gathered people from the European Union, saying that they've got to support right-wing parties. And there's this right-wing party in Germany that just finished second in their election, and boy, they're rubbing their hands about that. And now Donald Trump's decided to screw over Ukraine. He's saying, well, we've put billions of dollars into Ukraine, and now we want billions back. They've got to give us their minerals. And he's talking around them. He's been quietly meeting with the Russians. They are, in fact, the ones who are being held to ransom by Zalensky, who he called him a dictator. I mean, isn't that what Putin is? And now he's saying that actually it was not the Russians that invaded Ukraine that started that war. So I don't know. It's just endless, Johnny. I'm so incredibly pissed at Donald Trump. What do you think?
I completely share your viewpoint. Completely and utterly pissed is exactly the words I would use. However, I am starting to shift my thinking in terms of this guy is a complete bonehead. However, what do we do next? And I think we're starting to see the de-Americanization of the world. We're starting to go, guess what, bonehead and bonehead government? We get you're the most powerful economy. We get you have the biggest military, but we're going to try to live without you. We're going to try to do things without you interfering in our lives. That's tough, but you can start to see it all over the place. I think Pierre...
You're talking about Canada now. You're saying Canada.
I'm saying Canada and the rest of the world. Justin Trudeau is in Kiev with about a dozen other folks, and they're talking about, peace treaties and stuff like that. Americans are not there. Russians are not there. We're starting to slowly see the de-Americanization. Will this happen in our lifetime? Maybe not. But we have to start disentangling ourselves from this complete idiot.
I see it more that it's the fracturing of the world into power segments under dictators. We've got Putin. He wants to run Russia. He wants to run Russian satellites. We've got China. They want a hegemony in Asia. And Trump wants North America. He wants Canada. He wants Greenland. He wants Mexico at least under his thumb. And we have a lot of work ahead if we're going to detangle from that, because 80% of our exports have been going to the U.S. We're so locked in so many ways with the United States.
Well,
yes, we've got to move to the European Union. Yes, we've got to move to more trade with Asia. We've got to do a lot of things very quickly because we are in big trouble. And at the same time, we got Donald Trump. He's preaching to the converted. And he's talking about Ukraine. He just had a big address sort of, again, reiterating all of his complaints about the way Ukraine has conducted himself and what they are going to owe America.
I've spoken to President Putin, and I think that thing is going to end, but it's got to end. It's a horrible, horrible thing to watch. I'm dealing with President Zelensky. I'm dealing with President Putin. I'm trying to get the money back or secured because, Europe has given $100 billion. The United States has given $350 billion because we had a stupid, incompetent president and administration. 350. But here's worse. Europe gave it in the form of a loan. They get their money back. We gave it in the form of nothing, so I want them to give us something for all of the money that we put up, and I'm going to try and get the war settled, and I'm going to try and get all that death ended.
Trump also, again, has reiterated the 51st state status for Canada. We have these tariffs hanging over our heads. We're very close now to the final decision in the federal Liberal Party about who their new leader is going to be. It's going to be Mark Carney. Mark Carney is going to be the leader. For the short term, at least, he's going to be the prime minister. And we will, I think, see an election quickly, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Don't be surprised, though, if there is a quick election, because I don't know that he really wants to sit around and try to defend what the Liberals have done over the last 10 years, John.
Uh, even in our fantastic country, Canada, this is all a little bit unsettling. First of all, I thought the Liberals would rebound. Never in my lifetime did I think they might rebound to where they might win. Secondly, I'm not comfortable with having an unelected politician and a non-politician become prime minister of our country. I get how that's going to happen. If the Liberal parties pick a leader, that person becomes prime minister. I am not comfortable with that. So I need to see an election right away, and I need to see both parties identify what they're going to do to further my theory from earlier in the show, the de-Americanization from this complete bonehead down south.
And so, of course, we have the Conservatives now looking at the same polls we're all looking at, seeing that the Liberals have really picked up steam. In some of the polls, it's almost neck and neck between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, although it's very early to make any predictions in that regard. So what do we have? We got Pierre Poilievre stepping up and saying exactly what he has planned to get the country moving forward.
Now, Liberals would like to instrumentalize the tariff threat to distract from the record of the Carney-Trudeau Liberals over the last 9 years. They say that we should just forget about all the damage they've done to our country because of the tariffs that might be coming down the road. In fact, the opposite is true. Think of it, my friends. If Carney-Trudeau policies did this much economic harm before tariffs, imagine the devastation they would cause after tariffs. My common sense plan to unleash the production of our resources will allow us to be self-sufficient. We will incentivize Indigenous leaders to support these projects by letting companies pay a share of their federal corporate taxes to local First Nations. Second, I'm announcing, and by the way, that will allow First Nations to spend that on clean drinking water and a better future for their people. I want the First Nations people of Canada to be the richest people in the world. I am announcing today that within 60 days of taking office, I will repeal the unconstitutional No New Pipelines Law, C-69.
So, for the better part of 6 months, our viewers have noticed and noted that I want solutions. And this is what the Conservative Party is beginning to provide. The Liberals had better do the same, and quickly. So let me just summarize what I think they're going to do, the Conservatives, and what I want them to do. And that is remove interprovincial barriers to trade. We in Canada have to be trading with other provinces as easily as I go walk down the street and buy something. We need to diversify our trading partners. Where are you, Europe? Where are you, Australia? Where are you, China? Where are you, Mexico? Let's do it. We have to boycott U.S. goods. Sorry, but that is my opinion, and we need to now treat them like they're treating us. And finally, and maybe most importantly, build the friggin' pipelines. Let's get our resources traveling across Canada, across those oceans, into our newly diversified trade partners. This must happen for LNG, for oil, and anything else that goes through those pipelines. It's got to happen. All of these things, it has to happen yesterday.
I think you're right, John. I think we're in agreement. How about that? We're in agreement on the Rumble Room. And, you may hear the Liberals starting to campaign on these same issues. If they're smart, they will. Because this is what people around the coffee clutch are talking about. They're saying we've got to do something now. We can't sit around and plan. We'll have a planning group.
Right.
We'll have a committee to study this. I mean, we can't do that anymore. We've got to start unlocking all of these resources and get them out for export, and we've got to find new markets right away. The Americans are obviously becoming very isolationist in their views. That's not going to change. And their definition of democracy seems to be rapidly changing. It's very much from the top down. Donald Trump he's even described himself as a king. He wants to rule from the center. He admires people like Putin. He admires people from like Xi in China because, well, let's face it, they're not even elected and they rule everything. Trump would like to do the same. So we've got to give this all some distance. So you wonder what's the fuel behind it? Like, what's the fuel behind Donald Trump? Why has he been able to really march in this direction and take at least half of America with him? Well, Mark Milke is the president of the Aristotle Society. That's a think tank in Calgary. He's written a new book, and it is called The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture is Wrecking Civilization. No kidding. And we thought the book was timely to have Mark Milke back on the show. So let's zoom him in. And so now joining us once again is Mark Milke from the Aristotle Foundation, all the way to sunny Alberta. And Mark, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
Excited about your book. I've got your book here. It was great to see it and read it. And it's called The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture is Wrecking Civilization. And before I ask my first question, I'm just going to run through a few of the points you made where you kind of define what a victim cult actually is. And you say here, and I'll just quickly do it point by point, any person or group focused on the past over the present at the expense of the future, where imagined or real victimization dominates a person's life, where people obsess over others who they hold responsible for their condition, and where individuals and groups feel victimized and are constantly looking for someone to blame. Well, that covers a lot of ground, which is, of course, why there's lots of pages in this book. So that's it's important to cover all of these points, and we'll try to do some of that in this interview, Mark. And I'm thinking right off the top, some of these grievances, and some of this kind of sounds a little bit like let's make America great again. Some of the grievances are supposed grievances that Donald Trump talks about, all the things that are going wrong with America and how we're being ripped off by this and ripped off by that, and America's never had it worse. Do you think that the tactics that he's using as a politician have gained support in some ways because he is pressing the buttons that you are talking about in your outline?
I think so. And Donald Trump makes a cameo appearance in the book, as you know. So I think, yes, he actually, and his own sort of story, his own narrative from 2016 onward, if not before, but certainly when he got into politics in 2016, has been a constant litany of grievances. Now, like any politician, any person can point to actual, victimization or grievances where they've been treated unfairly, and in some cases egregiously so. And so in the victim cult, I go from what I call mild to moderate to severe, if I can put it that way. And I would say Donald Trump's claims are kind of mild to moderate, right? They're not like Germans claiming, they were hard done by the rest of us in the 1920s, or, so on and so forth, which led to some pretty, obviously awful results in the 1930s in Germany. So Donald Trump is on the mild to moderate spectrum, I would say, of the grievance culture. Nonetheless, I included him in the book precisely because he's a public figure, because he's unlike past American presidents, almost up to him, that never would have exploited the grievance culture and legitimate or illegitimate narratives or grievances to such an extent. And it's unbecoming of the president, for one thing, and also in some cases it's simply not true. I mean, his false claim that he lost the 2020, or that he won the 2020 election. That's an example of a grievance that I have in the victim cult. And I've got plenty from, say, the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, political spectrum in the United States and Canada, certainly in Canada. But Donald Trump is a classic case of someone who exploits real or imagined grievances, and I think is doing so increasingly destructively.
Thank you. I'm a victim of I don't know what I don't know. Wow, amazing. And this is such an important topic. Okay, and covers so much ground. So let me talk. Here's an angle I'm going to go after with you. I noticed how you have Ellis Ross writing the foreword in your book. Ellis has been a regular guest on our show. He's, of course, the chief of the Haisla First Nations in Kitimat. Later was the MLA for Skeena, and a driving force in getting LNG pipeline to Kitimat to export liquid natural gas to the world. Wish they'd done more of that. Nonetheless, Ellis talks about the real hardship of Indigenous people, but also about the need to move past feelings of victimhood to build a better future. Have you seen many examples of First Nations leadership elsewhere moving in this direction?
Some, and frankly, some of the First Nations leadership on the negative side of things was really the spur for the book, right? In that I've probably done 30 years worth of policy work on First Nations around the country, and sadly, there are a number of, a great chunk of, great proportion, use the right English here, of First Nations chief that play the grievance card, and I think to no good end for their own First Nations. However, there are some happy exceptions. Ellis is one of them. I grew up in Kelowna, the West Bank First Nation. Others in the Okanagan Sunbelt and Wine region also have taken advantage of that location. Not all of them, but certainly some of them have. Near Osuyas, the Osuyas First Nation, the West Bank First Nation, others. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, there are some First Nations that do very well because they've said, look, we're near, the oil sands, for example. So there's some up there. There's some in Saskatchewan. There's some that are near urban locations, which have taken advantage of that. So, but the Indigenous issue in Canada is probably one of the best examples of victim culture, for good or bad, in the sense that nobody would deny there have been wrongs done in history. I take exception to the notion we're a genocidal nation state because we're not. I think that claim is ridiculous, and I point that out in the book. I also think it's dangerous to focus on the past. This is why Ellis wrote the foreword. Ellis and I met some years ago, and we started talking, and he liked the idea of what I was writing in terms of the victim cult, and that's when I asked him to write the foreword. Because no one denies that wrongs are done, but wrongs are done with respect all over history. If you go back far enough, any of our ancestors or any of our ethnicities or anyone in our nation states will have done something wrong to someone else without making light of that. But the danger is if you get stuck there, as opposed to asking, yeah, okay, but what's the good and bad in history? What can we learn from that, and how can we move forward? And it doesn't mean you always don't do anything about past wrongs. If Robin tomorrow steps on my foot and breaks my foot, I may sue him for, fixing up the injury or what have you. Then, look, things that happen more recently, you want to compensate. I think if you only focus on the past wrongs, you have the potential for missing what leads to the problems, the bad outcomes and reserves today. To cut to a clear example, what leads to bad outcomes today? Well, if you're in northern Canada on a reserve in the middle of nowhere, I think that's actually your biggest problem, not historic wrongs. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're not in the Sun Belt like the Okanagan, where you can take advantage of some of that, as West Bank does and others do, as I mentioned. But I think we have to recognize what's causing current problems. Geography is one of them. You're never going to be successful, arguably in northern Manitoba, right? Because we got a 2-century precedent of the Industrial Revolution, people moving from rural areas to the cities because they had to. That's where the education was. That's where the opportunities were. So I think it's wrong to simply look back and blame everything on the past. And I do think that happens within some Indigenous communities and among some Indigenous leaders. Ellis Ross and others are the exception, though.
I guess we always have to be careful around those lines and where to find understanding, and then also where to try to encourage all of us to move forward on these issues. I wanted to ask you, Mark, about the tendency of groups to wrap themselves in various flags. And it's sort of almost, is it a protection? Is it a symbol? You think about the MAGA people and all their U.S. flags and hats. You think about the pro-Palestinian movement marching through our streets for the last year or two, all upset about what's been going on in the Gaza and waving flags madly, especially in Jewish neighborhoods. And you had the truckers movement also with Canadian flags and their honking horns and driving through our streets. And all of these groups seem to have some similar grievances coming from different places, but still grievances. And it seems that underlines it is a feeling of victimhood. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but again, I think specifics matter, and I don't think we should dismiss sometimes the claims of victimhood, but we should parse through them. So in the case of MAGA Republicans, for example, or Americans in general, they're not wrong to complain that Europe and Canada do not spend enough in defense. I'm not sure that the way to go about making us and the Europeans pay more, which we should for defense, is to, I think, dangerously crater NATO, which I think is happening under Donald Trump, and to take sides with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine has just happened recently at the United Nations. I think that's dangerously naive, reckless, pick an adjective, pick a description. But, the grievance is not wrong in some cases, or the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not wrong to be aggrieved. I think they've got the wrong target when they target Israel and when they target Jews in general, and the anti-Semitism that we've seen, in large measure in that movement on our streets in Canada and around the world. But who should the Palestinians be blaming for their condition? I would argue not Israel, which has made peace agreements with Egypt in the late 1970s, with Jordan in the 1980s, which offered a peace deal to Yasser Arafat, then the Palestinian PLO leader, in 2000. That offer came from Ehud Barak, the then Prime Minister of Israel, and Bill Clinton, the President of the United States at the time. They offered the Palestinians and Yasser Arafat 97% of what they wanted. Yasser Arafat walks away from the table. And also, Gazans voted for Hamas, and I think it was 2006 or 7. So they should be blaming Hamas. They should be blaming the late Yasser Arafat for walking away from the table, because that's the cause of their woes. And in fact, some in the Arab world have been rejecting Israel ever since 1948. But increasingly,
I am talking about the protesters we see on our streets. I'm talking about a lot of university students who've never ever been to the Middle East, who are marching around with headdresses. Are they the flip side of the same coin as the truckers movement? I guess was my question.
No, because look, my policy, if I can put it that way, or my thinking on this is, look, I don't want environmentalists or Indigenous activists or truckers blocking streets, right? I don't, sure, show up for half an hour, make your point, and leave and get off the street. And don't harass people in universities. Certainly don't harass people in front of synagogues, in front of coffee shops, this sort of thing. Have a civil protest and then leave, and don't stay there for days or weeks or months in some cases. But I wouldn't put the truckers as equivalent to the Palestinians who showed up on the streets of Canada in the past year, or others who were sympathetic with them, because I think the truckers are trying to earn a living. I don't have a problem with vaccination. That's a whole other show. But look, I do not equate the truckers with the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel protests in the past year and a half, which showed up in Canadian streets, because I think it's pretty vile. And they blame the wrong people. Like I said, blame Yasser Arafat, blame Hamas, blame Iran, which is behind a lot of this, which funded a lot of this, and certainly funded the terror that came from Hamas and Hezbollah. And so, insofar as people want to show up in Canadian streets and complain about Jews, about Israel, give me a break.
Along with the theme of the victim cult, and once again, apologies for alluding to a potential past answer here. You also talk about Canada's apologizing culture. We've certainly seen a number of our prime ministers and premiers apologizing for actions of past governments, as you've said, sometimes for actions that took place a century ago. Because of this, we've seen flags flown at half-mast, some statues of historical figures removed. Where does this sorry, Mark, but where does this apologizing culture come from?
John, good question. I apologize for not having a succinct answer. Yeah, look, I think part of it comes from a good place where you recognize wrongs are done in the past. The problem I have with political apologies is sometimes I don't think they're sincere, or even if they are sincere, they don't actually have a grasp on the historical accuracy of the situation. And it's a bit what? It's a bit puffery, if I can put it that way. I think the problem with the apology culture coming from politicians is it kind of condemns the past, and the past can't talk back. If you're Justice Matthew Begbie, or the first colonial governor of British Columbia, James Douglas, there's another side of the entire story as well, which is, again, let me back up. James Douglas, these days, let me try a different tack. I'm thinking on the fly here with you gentlemen both. In the 1950s, John Wayne movies, right? The white guy is always the hero. The Indigenous fellow is always the sidekick, and sometimes put down and treated in a way that's not exactly great, to put it mildly, and condescendingly so. If I was Indigenous, I'd be kind of annoyed if I watched 1950s movies. I think, on the other hand, these days we flip to the reverse, where we romanticize Indigenous culture bluntly. That's not any better. Because in the reality of British Columbia, the early days of British Columbia, who held slaves up until the late 19th century, when the British colonialists like James Douglas was trying to stamp it out? Indigenous, with due respect, Indigenous First Nations in some cases, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, all the way up to Alaska.
All right, so let's get back again to the victim culture, and you dedicate some chapters, some very interesting names, and I want to get into that for a minute. I'm wondering whether Donald Trump isn't repeating history.
So what disturbs me about what I'm seeing in parts of the United States, but around the world, is an attack internally and externally on these accomplishments of you could say Western civilization broadly, or more narrowly, the Anglosphere, where these benefits were spread around the world, right? The South Koreans came to our side. The South Koreans used to have very corrupt governments. They just tossed a guy who tried to impose martial law without reason.
Right.
The South Koreans in the 1980s had corrupt leaders, and Reagan and others put the pressure on to go to elections, and they did. And what I'm seeing, what you're seeing, I think, is a reversal of that around the world. And it does concern me because, again, there's internal and external attacks on the accomplishments of the Anglosphere. And this wasn't just, the benefit to non-Americans. The fact that the Americans kind of led the way in this in the post-war world because no one else could. And they have this idealistic streak in most years, which is submerged right now. But the Americans generally want to do good, right? That's part of their founding narrative. Their founding, we don't want to be like the Europeans. We want peace, and we favor anyway. I mean, they do have an idealistic impulse, but I think they're somewhat tired. And again, this is where I can understand they're tired after Iraq and Afghanistan, where it feels like they got ripped off, and most of the rest of us didn't contribute. We contributed some troops in the case of
Well, we
Canada.
did quite a bit in
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
we did, but
Yeah.
still, they were the heavy lifters. So I can understand, especially now that Afghanistan and Iraq have slid backward in many respects, especially Afghanistan. You look around the world and you go, what did we just do for the last 20 years? And so there's a legitimate kind of grievance and annoyance, to put it mildly. Nonetheless, I think Americans also benefited from the post-war world, this trading relationship they had with the rest of the world, and that they protected around the world, Japan, East Asia, Europe. Americans benefited from that in their living standards and by trading with the rest of the world as much as the rest of the world benefited from trading with Americans. And that's been forgotten right now in the United States because you don't have leaders that say it out loud or understand it even. And that's what concerns me. So again, I'm not anti, MAGA Republicans. I just think some of them, unfortunately, don't get the inheritance that they've been given. And the president of the United States certainly does not. And that is very concerning when you see who has been hanging around with lately and who has been criticizing, right? Criticizing Vladimir Zalensky and praising Putin, or at least doing deals with Putin or attempting to.
So thanks very much again to Mark Milke. So much food for thought there, and we'll definitely have him back. He's written several books. He's a very smart guy. He used to be the head of the Taxpayers Federation in British Columbia. That's how I first met Mark Milke some time ago, and a great and interesting guest. So a couple of footnotes before we let you go. No question, Doug Ford is going to be the next premier, or be the premier again in the province of Ontario. He's way ahead in the polls, and we heard Rich Coleman last week being critical that he called the election in the middle of this big crisis with the Americans and tariffs, but he, I believe, did the right thing because he said, I need the mandate to stand up to the USA, and people are going to give him that mandate. Also, the NDP, the provincial NDP, David Eby and company, they may have a very rugged time this spring in the legislature. The opposition is feisty, and there's only a couple of seats that are separating them. So it's going to be, I think, a more conservative NDP going forward than we've seen in recent memory because they want to stay in power. We'll see how that goes. And also, I want to give a big salute to the Canada men's hockey team who won the Four Nations Cup in overtime. It was McDavid wide open because Matthews didn't stay on his man, and we scored that goal. Great for Canada, considering Donald Trump had actually phoned the U.S. team and said, you guys got to beat these guys. It's very important to America. Well, it was very good for Canada that we beat them. We didn't just beat the U.S. team, we beat Donald Trump. And a final word, our deepest condolences from the Rumble Room and from John and myself to the friends and family of Mel Cooper, the longtime head of CFAX Radio, Santa's Anonymous, many other worthy endeavors. In 2016, he was named Lifetime Achievement Award in the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. Like John and myself, he's a governor of the chamber. He will be deeply missed in our community, Johnny, and boy, a guy to live up to.
Absolutely. Completely agree with everything that you have just indicated. Back in the day, when I was starting to get involved with networking and business and chamber, let's call that 30 years ago, Mel Cooper and a series of folks like that were the business leaders in our community. And they were helpful. And they wanted to help people of disadvantaged folks. They wanted to help business, and they wanted to help the middle class and communities. They wanted to help everyone, and they did a great job. And they asked for help from everyone, and they listened to people. that's sadly lacking these days. Sadly lacking is this desire to help the community grow. We seem to be going in circles. So, Mel, terribly sad that you're gone, but I really hope that your legacy continues. And we're going to continue to ask for solutions and ask for how we can, convey ideas to help the community on the Rumble Room. And you can reach us in so many ways. And here we go. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, podcasting, TikTok, and Instagram. And all of those ways you can reach us and reinforce the spirit that Mel Cooper started along with a whole bunch of other great business and community leaders. And we hope to continue that. My name is John Juricic, and I hope we rumble on for a long time, Robin.
Johnny, every time I hear you say this, it inspires me. I get all jazzed up for the whole week, and I will continue to be inspired as we rumble on.